As a conservative, Stephen Harper was all too happy as Prime Minister to try to reduce trade barriers abroad and protectionism at home. And he had some success with that. Having said that, he also governed during the worst recession since the Great Depression and did things that under normal circumstances no conservative would celebrate. For a look at the Harper Trade and Investment Policy record, we welcome Laura Dawson, Director of the Canada Institute of the Wilson Centre. She's in Washington, D.C. And Laura, it's good to have you back on our airwaves. How are you tonight?
I'm fine, thank you, Steve. Nice to be here.
Great. How hands-on, in your view, was Stephen Harper when it came to his trade and investment policy agenda?
Stephen Harper was very hands-on in trade and investment policy. In fact, in probably an unprecedented way. I mean, in the past, prime ministers would sort of weigh in on the broad strokes and the direction of trade and investment policy. But Stephen Harper was an economist. He really knew what was what. And people will say, the bad thing about Stephen Harper is he thinks he's the smartest man in any room. The good thing about Stephen Harper is he probably was the smartest man in many rooms on trade and investment policy. So he was really hands-on. I'm not sure his officials necessarily appreciated that. I'm not sure he got the best out of his trade ministers, but he was really focused on the trade and investment policies during his time in office.
We'll put up a bit of a chart here showing 10 sets of free trade agreements that his government successfully concluded. Everything from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and CETA with the European Union, all the way down Ukraine, South Korea, Honduras, Panama, Jordan, Colombia, Peru. As you look at that list, how impressive is it in your view?
Well, it is an impressive list because in terms of numbers, you see a lot of points on the board. But every trade agreement is a bit different, and they're done for very different reasons. For example, I don't think many would argue with the fact that the agreement with Ukraine was more of a political agreement. It was more of a Ukraine is our ally, and we want to show them support because fundamentally Canada and Ukraine produce the same thing. So, trading wheat for wheat and pork for pork is not a really productive economic initiative. On the other hand, getting through the CETA, getting through most of the negotiations on the TPP, that was important. I think a big change under Stephen Harper that was different from previous governments was the intention to do trade agreements that really had some trade impact, that were focused on Canada's trading advantages, that were looked at where the puck was going, where Canada wanted to be trading, and to focus the trade in that direction. Previously, the approach was kind of scattergun. Previous governments didn't really know the implications, opportunities, limitations of trade agreements, so they were kind of hither and yon. I think Stephen Harper took a more focused approach to the agreements that he and his government pursued.
I have to assume that in his heart of hearts as a conservative economist, Stephen Harper can't have agreed with the supply management system that oversees much of the Canadian agricultural sector, particularly the dairy industry in Quebec and parts of eastern Ontario. Did he do much about that during his time as PM?
Well, he didn't phone me and ask me about, what was in his heart of hearts. But if you sort of follow the breadcrumbs through his policy trajectory, it seems to me that that was a government that was really prepared to phase out or at least significantly diminish supply management. We heard about studies taking place, so how you would compensate the farmers who held dairy quota. We saw the various limitations coming forward. There's a limitation in the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement, and we heard that he was prepared to go to the table to make some significant reductions at the TPP. Canada was never called on to do this, but it was my sense that they were ready to act if necessary.
And similarly, admittedly, neither you nor I know what's in his heart, but we have a sense, I think, of how he thinks, and the notion that Stephen Harper, again, conservative economist, would somehow use the resources of the Government of Canada to purchase 2 auto companies, again, is nothing that I suspect he came to office intending to do, but he did it. He helped save GM and Chrysler. In hindsight, good or bad decision?
Well, at the time, I think it was the best decision possible. I mean, he was a conservative economist, but the politics of trade, the politics of who does what where in Canada are very, very important. And when you're talking about potential job loss in central Canada, it's very hard to argue with the necessity of some sort of temporary measures to stop the bleeding in that sector. I think that every prime minister, every trade minister has to walk the line between innovation, hey, let's try this new trade agreement, and responsiveness, building resilience, building stability for what's going on in the world around them. And Stephen Harper, I think, had a very ambitious trade agenda about advancing Canada's position in the world as a global trader, and then he got hit with the global financial crisis, and then he got hit with a lot of things outside of Canada's control, where he had to exercise, judgment and stewardship and things that maybe went against his more open trade ethos.
Let me follow up on one of those files in particular, and that is the relationship with China. He came into office talking very tough on China, very tough on human rights, obviously, again, as a political conservative, unhappy with the authoritarian nature of their government. But at some point, realizing Canada was getting frozen out of a lot of Chinese economic development, he pivoted. How successfully, in your view?
Well, I don't think anything happens quickly with China. I think his pivot came with the recognition that 1.4 billion Chinese consumers with growing incomes and urbanization and demand for things that Canada has to sell, that was a pretty compelling argument. So he started the pivot towards China, towards more productive economic engagement. He sort of took 2 steps forward and 1 step back in terms of the formalized relationships that he had with China, but I think many of those things, the studies, the engagement between the governments, the feasibility research that they did, I think all of that laid the groundwork for what we now see with the subsequent Trudeau government, where they seem to be on a path towards closer engagement with China.
And again, as a person who would have supported free trade where possible and in principle, he supports the idea of foreign companies investing in Canada, similarly Canadian companies taking over companies in other countries. Having said that, when China tried to buy some energy companies in Western Canada, in his home province of Alberta, need we say, how did he respond to all of that?
Yeah, it's another case where politics trumped good judgment, or at least economic judgment on an issue. And the backlash against Chinese buying and accumulating Canadian resources, Canadian assets in sensitive sectors, there was just too much pushback, I think, for the Harper government to appear to do nothing. And so they put in a temporary moratorium on investment. They beefed up the review system. They put some things into the procedures surrounding the Investment Canada Act that were clearly addressed to China and probably were more effective as political band-aids than they were as actual economic instruments.
Let me read this. This is a quote from your essay in the book, The Harper Factor. You write, Canada stands to gain $7.8 billion in new exports annually by 2030 as a result of a free trade agreement with China. Canada's pork, oilseeds, and green technology industries stand to make particular gains. Focused engagement with China is one area in which the new Trudeau government could succeed, where the Harper government fell short. And I guess the question is, why do you think the Harper government fell short in this particular area?
Well, I think, as we've talked about, the Harper government was responsive to sensitivities and concerns that engagement with China was just moving too fast, too hard, into too many sectors. We didn't know these people. They were raising suspicions in all sorts of people. So there was a need to sort of take a deep breath. At the same time, I think the Trudeau government's got a little bit more time and experience on this file, and I think they're willing to take a chance to at least consider negotiating an agreement with China. And I tell you, I've been doing a lot of research on this lately. I've been looking at the China agreement with Australia. I've been looking at how they negotiate other free trade agreements. It's a really tough road. The sorts of market access gains that I talked about in that chapter, the if everything works out, here's what we're going to get in pork and canola, those are really astonishing numbers. But the real trick is not to reduce tariff barriers. The trick is to reduce non-tariff barriers in China. Things like inspection and certification and health and safety. Not that we don't want countries to have those rules, but we don't want them to use those rules in a targeted, punitive way that isn't based on science. So that's the real challenge for Canada, but also a really good reason to be talking to China about ways to find mutually acceptable, upgraded rules for the two countries to do business.
Laura, as you look at the world and you consider all of the different files that the Prime Minister had to deal with during his nearly 10 years as Prime Minister, can you point to one and say, yep, he really nailed it there. That was a good decision. Canada made progress, and we'll feel that for years to come.
If we were talking a month ago, I would have said the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But who knows what's going to happen with the TPP. The TPP was a really important mechanism for upgrading the rules, for bringing trade rules and practices into the 21st century to deal with the digital economy. Wasn't so much able to achieve that there. I think if it's not a home run, then it's certainly a three-base hit, is the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. That was the first agreement that Canada did after the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement with another developed industrialized economy. And the way that those countries talk is a lot different. And they're talking about the sorts of things that Canada does well: digital services, financial services, banking, engineering, government procurement. It's not just about, corn brooms and pork bellies. It is sort of the economy of the future. So getting that CETA deal done and getting it done before things blew up with Brexit and the U.S. TTIP with the EU fell off the rails. That was a really important thing to have done, and that government pushed hard to get the broad strokes done. And then the Trudeau government came in and tied up the package and put a red bow on it.
Gotcha, Laura. We always appreciate having you on the program. You illuminate our audience so much, and we're also happy to facilitate the opportunity for you to say hi to your mother and grandmother in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which if you want to do now,
hi,
now's
Nana.
the time.
All right. Hey. Hello, Nana.
There you go. Laura
Thanks,
Dawson
Steve.
from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And we welcome back the co-editors of The Harper Factor. There's Jennifer Ditchburn and Graham Fox for some concluding comments about Stephen Harper's legacy as Prime Minister of Canada. Jen, let's start with this. We've had 23 prime ministers in Canada. Stephen Harper is the 6th longest serving of all time,
yes.
Almost 10 years in power. In your view, did he have a long-term impact on public policy in the country?
The way that we put it is that he was not a transformational prime minister, and we don't necessarily think that's a negative thing. It's just that he didn't, there's nothing that I think you can look at 10, 20 years from now, and you can say that's what Stephen Harper did in the area of public policy. He had a tremendous impact in the area of politics. I mean, you can't take that away. What he did uniting the party, the way that he conducted politics, all of that, yes, absolutely. He had a huge impact. But in public policy, it would be challenging to name a single thing on which we'd say that is Stephen Harper's big legacy.
That's a pretty harsh verdict, if I may say, because obviously prime ministers, I guess you separate them into two camps. You were transactional, meaning you sort of minded the store, and you were transformational. You changed the country. GST, free trade, Brian Mulroney. Harper strictly transactional in your view as well?
Yeah, I would share that view. And I think something Jennifer said is really important in that the longevity in office is in itself an achievement, and therefore Mr. Harper's place in the history books is assured. But when you try to strip away, and I think it may be of interest to your viewers to know this, but the genesis of this book actually far predates his defeat in October 2015. And in fact, this book was coming out regardless of the results of the last election. And in fact, much of it was written before we knew the results of the last election. And it was a conversation that Jennifer and I were having that much was being written about the personality of the man and the way he conducted politics, but precious little was looking at what was his actual impact on public policy. And so once you strip away the political achievements and the fact that most political parties today are emulating some of the things that he did as the leader of the Conservative Party, but you look at the achievements of government and how lasting the change is, and now, with the benefit of a year since the change in government, of looking at the ease with which the policy legacy is being dismantled, as Jennifer says, it's hard to imagine what is left after 5 years or 10 years that can compare to Prime Minister Mulroney's free trade agreements and acid rain treaties, or the first Prime Minister Trudeau's Charter of Rights, and so on and so forth. Hard to point to the one thing that kind of stays with Canadians beyond the current generation.
And the way of doing politics, by the way, I think had an impact on the policy legacy. So that the approach to politics in which you marginalize your enemies or you marginalize people that don't agree with you, you call them traitors, or you say if you're not with us, you're with the Taliban and so on, or environmentalists call all of those aspects. When you don't bring people into the tent, it's very hard to lead on major transformational projects.
Well, here's how you guys put it in the book. Winning 3 consecutive mandates and remaining in office almost 10 years is a feat few Canadian political leaders have achieved. And so Harper is assured a place in history. But that is a political achievement, not a policy achievement. We are at a loss to note one signature policy achievement that will, in future years, define his prime ministership. One wonders what will be left of the Harper legacy after even one Trudeau term. That's pretty harsh, Graham. Really? You got nothing? You got nothing, eh?
Well, it is hard to think of one kind of substantive change. And I think part of the reason for that is, Prime Minister Harper's time in office has elicited a lot of strong opinions, good or bad, among many Canadians. But what we found in this book is his impact on public policy isn't one thing. It's much more nuanced than his biggest supporters or most vehement detractors would like to let on. And so his record is nuanced, as is the case for many prime ministers. But I think his commitment to make policy decisions largely on the impact it may have on electoral politics, in many cases, does mean that you weren't swinging for the fences for much of that decade.
No,
you were looking for single hits.
He was a single sitter, no doubt about it. Yeah. Okay, well, for political wonks everywhere, we recommend for their reading edification, The Harper Factor, Assessing a Prime Minister's Policy Legacy. Jennifer Ditchburn and Graham Fox from the IRPP, it's good to have you here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.